Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone, as well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of videos that have not released to the internet. So you can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Dr. Joshua Bowen, your book, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, is a controversial book, but it covers a lot of good information, mostly scholarship, critical scholarship even. We talked about why it's important to know the Old Testament narrative, and you actually do a recap of the narrative. And like, I can't tell you how many times did I message you while I was reading this, like, hold on, I read and I didn't notice that. And that recap was interesting in the narrative.
Yeah.
However, why is it important to know the historical background? I mean, what's the difference? Aren't they the same thing, Dr. Josh?
Yeah. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
Yeah.
So no, oddly enough. A lot of times they are similar, right? So I guess if you think about it in the way that let's say you had a feud with your neighbor, and he went out and cut your tree down. A tree that was on your yard, but one of the branches was going over into his yard, and he came out and started hacking it down. If the police came and said, hey, what happened? The way that you would tell that story is, hey, he came over here and totally unprovoked, started hacking at my tree, doing it to be very vindictive. What a terrible guy. He's just awful. And of course, he intentionally put that tree there and made it so that it grew over here, and he mocked me with it. So, the story itself, it's what is it that actually happened is important to recognize. That's obviously incredibly simplistic, but when you think about things like in the Bible, sort of the general rule of thumb is the further back you go in chronological in time as far as the story is concerned, the less reliable the Bible is.
Right.
So, if you're looking at something like the Exodus, for example, or the conquest of Joshua, it's very important to understand the history of the period, because the way the Bible presents it, it's supposed to be happening in the second half of the second millennium, right? Some people would say it's, 15th century, some people would say it's 13th century, whatever. In either case, it's supposed to be happening at a time that, Egypt's in control of Canaan, right? If you're going by what the biblical text says. Now, of course, if you take a later date, then, Egypt's starting to lose control, but nonetheless, it's very problematic for, 2.5 million Israelites, not including the mixed multitude that's supposed to come with them, to walk out of Egypt in the 15th or even in the 13th century, wander around for 40 years in the wilderness, and then go into a land that either is directly controlled by Egypt, or very recently controlled by Egypt, and have these stories make sense, right? So this idea that there are huge walled cities, they're under the control of these great kings, not tenable, historically speaking. So if you know that historical background, then it makes the Exodus like, okay, we've got to think of a different way to understand this. It's not a historical text that's trying to write that we should be taking as historically reliable. So that's something that's older in biblical chronology. But what about things that are later, first millennium stuff? Once you're in the first millennium, at least, down into the 8th century and moving forward, maybe even the 9th century, things start to become more reliable, right? And so like Joel Baden has written a book that talks about David, and what is it that we think about David? And of course, he would argue that there's contemporary historical tradition that David, it's coming from David, and there's an apologetic that's built up around it. So that's an interesting thing to think about, because if the story of David with, say, Nabal, he gives in his book, he gives the story of Nabal, the guy that he essentially does like a, what do you call it, like the mob, the mafia thing where you go up to a store that has this beautiful front window, and you say, it's a beautiful front window. It'd be a shame for it to get completely smashed, but I tell you what, for a small fee, we'll protect this window for your business. We'll look after it. And you'd be like, whoa, wait a minute. What you're saying is if I don't pay you, you're going to shatter my glass, right? And that's what happens with David, right? David has some of his men going before him and go to this guy Nabal and say, hey, we've been protecting your flock, out in the countryside. So, you should pay us for protecting your flock. And Naval's like, I didn't hire you. What are you talking about? This is like a mob thing, And of course, then David's men come, and eventually Nabal ends up dead. And David marries his wife and gets all his property. So the way that the text spins that story is, Nabal, whose name means fool, is this horrible guy according to the story, and he's set up as the bad guy, and David is he's the good guy, and he's just doing the right thing, and he's completely blown off by this Nabal guy. So terrible, his hospitality, and to the point that Naval's wife comes out and says, I'm so sorry for what Nabal has done. So understanding the historical background gives you, what can we say about this story? What makes sense? What doesn't make sense? So that's sort of in the in-between, right? We have a story that's probably got a historical kernel, some contemporary tradition, whatever, but has been spun. Clearly there's some spinning going on. But then, knowing the historical background of the ancient Near East lets you figure out the problems with books like the Book of Daniel. So the Book of Daniel presents history of the 6th century in a way that you go, do what? Like, we know that there are problems with, what Daniel says. For example, Nebuchadnezzar is cast as the king that takes the temple vessels from the temple, and which is true. However, his son, Belshazzar, which he's not his son, is supposed to be the one that is co-regent with him. And of course, we know that's not true. It's Nabonidas that is Belshazzar's father. And so the traditions that are clearly supposed to be credited to Nabonidas are being transferred to Nebuchadnezzar. And if you don't know the historical background, you won't be able to pick up that that's what's going on, because Nebuchadnezzar has this madness that's attributed to him. And of course, this is a tradition that, Nabonidas, when he came to the throne, I think in his 3rd year, he just up and leaves and goes out to the oasis of Tema and stays there for like 10 years, right? And of course, that's seen as terrible by the Marduk priesthood. It's this crazy, strange thing. He starts worshiping the god Sin instead of Marduk. Anyway, the point is that these traditions of his madness, this weird behavior, we see it at Qumran, right? I think John Collins mentioned this in one of your interviews with him, where he talked about the Prayer of Nabinitis, right? This is a tradition that clearly it's supposed to be correctly attributed to Nabonidas, and we see that way at Qumran, but here in the book of Daniel, it's attributed to Nebuchadnezzar. Or Darius the Mede, another example. Because there is no Darius the Mede, right? And we know from history that it's probably Darius the First that tradition is supposed to be about. So anyway, the point is that you can look at something like the Exodus tradition, and if you know the Amarna period, where these, the history, know a lot of history from that period, we know that the Exodus and the conquest, very problematic. right? If we know, the early part of the first millennium, then we can see what's probably realistic about the David tradition and what's an apologetic, and sort of, parse those things out. But then, something later like the Neo-Babylonian, beginning of the Neo-Babylonian period, if we know the Neo-Babylonian rulers and what happened throughout that empire, well, then we can very quickly figure out that doesn't make sense in the book of Daniel, and that does make sense why it is that it looks that way. So it's really important to understand, just for those three quick examples, you can see how it's very important to understand, even in broad strokes, the historical background. So that's why chapter 2 of the book is dedicated to giving you, starting in the beginning of the third millennium BCE, all the way down to really the conquest of Alexander, so that you have sort of the highlights of ancient Near Eastern history. And I'll say this, it's not intended for you to walk away knowing all the history, right? Because it's a lot of information in there. And, I know Seth Andrews, when he read the audiobook, and he'll say it, like he said it on Twitter and Facebook several times, chapter 2 is he said it's the hardest chapter I've ever narrated. And it's because there are a lot of names, a lot of places, a lot of detail in there, not unnecessary detail, not detail that's really hard to understand, but it'd be hard to memorize it all. And that's not how it's intended. This is sort of meant to be like an encyclopedia, in the sense that you read through it, you get kind of the general flow of ancient Near Eastern history, how it relates to the Bible, the Old Testament. But then in a discussion a year from now, somebody says, oh yeah, the Exodus is totally cool and it matches history. And you're like, something's sparking in my mind. Let me go back and read that section on the Amarna period. And they go, okay, you know what, dude, this doesn't work. And if you want to dig deeper, well, I've got the bibliography there. So now you can go read the scholars that have written on this and get into more detail on that particular section.
So it begs the question to say, for those who are watching, atheist and non-atheist alike, is something to ask is, we're talking about the historical background. And my question is, looking at the Old Testament sources we have, if you were to compare them to other ancient Near Eastern sources, on a scale from don't trust this historically to this is more reliable historically, where would you place the Bible in that? Because Christians will try to say, you don't treat the Bible. They do this all the time with New Testament studies. I know from scholars I talk to, you don't treat the Bible as critically as you do these other sources. And then when you do try to point out, well, look, these other sources have gods and people in their narratives, they want to act like ours is more historically accurate and it's more reliable. But it sounds to me, maybe you are looking at other sources saying, no, we trust the Babylonian records on who reigned and when and these things. What about the reliability of the historical background on ancient Near Eastern sources and biblical, comparing the two?
Unfortunately, it's sort of apples and oranges. And what I mean by that is, let's take, for example, the reign of Nabinitis, or say it differently, the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire as depicted in the book of Daniel. If you go with the book of Daniel, Darius the Mede is the one that takes over in 539, and Belshazzar is the one that's on the throne. So if you remember the story, he's in there feasting, the hand, writing on the wall, weighed and found wanting, and that night the kingdom is taken from him, and Darius the Mede takes the throne. Okay, that is a much later text, right? The extant copies that we have, if we just go with that, the extant copies that we have, the earliest ones are from Qumran, right? And they date to the late 2nd century. So the documentation that we have is much, much later, even from the purported event. So if we were trying to access if we were trying to do historiography on Belshazzar or the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, there are other sources that we would use. Some of those would be contemporary, and they're not historiographic sources, even though there are some of those. You could look at, for example, administrative texts. So if we ask the question, just very quickly, Paul-Alain Beaulieu has, he did a lengthy study, I think in the 90s or late 80s, talking about the inscriptions and the life of Nabonides, the reign of Nabonides. And he's looking at everything from when he took the throne all the way through until Babylonia fell to Cyrus. And what he does is he shows through royal inscriptions or through economic texts, administrative texts, again, cuneiform documents in Akkadian that we have from the time. They date to that time.
Super reliable.
Yeah, and a lot of these are not propagandistic. Right? For example, if we're trying to figure out, is Belshazzar on the throne, like Daniel 5:6:1, presents, well, we have two administrative texts that show supplies going to where the prince is, and he's outside. He's at least on the outskirts of Babylonia, if not outside of Babylonia. Well, that's not a propagandistic document, right? It's not like a myth, or not a myth. It's not like a royal inscription. It's talking about how great he is, or so. This is just it's a text that says, such and such equipment or supplies being sent out to the prince outside of Babylonia. Sorry about my 3-year-old. It's bedtime.
That's normal. My kids used to do the same thing. He's just mad that you're not backing up the biblical sources. That's all it is. Yeah, right. It's what's Satan, right?
Just call my kid Satan. That's not what I meant.
No. I know. I'm just teasing.
So when we look at comparing those two, we have a document that comes from, that's been edited and comes from, edited and recopied, that comes from, 350 years later or something, if I'm doing the math quickly in my head. So hopefully I'm not wrong about that, but at least 3 centuries later. And we have contemporary, which is not without its theological commitments, right? And propagandistic purpose. And then we have these administrative texts which don't have that propagandistic function. They're just, nobody wrote that disbursement thinking, okay, now I've got to make sure that I show that Belshazzar is outside of Babylonia here, so how do I spin this? It's not just supplies going to it. Right, here you go. And there are 2 of them. So the point is, I suppose, that one, it's a different genre of text. It's one that doesn't have this motivation behind it. And so from a historiographic standpoint, it's much more trustworthy that it's representing the data accurately. So we also have things like the Babylonian Chronicle. The Babylonian Chronicle, it's not free from propagandistic tendencies. So it's like on the scale of straight trustworthiness or believability or something. You have to sort of put an administrative or an economic text over here on really trustworthy. And then as you start getting into these other documents, it's like, yeah, it's more trustworthy, it's less trustworthy, but it might not be like crazy untrustworthy. You just have to be a little more critical of it.
Kind of like Josephus. There's some trustworthy, but you also have to go, where's his religion coming in, and where is he just saying, and there were 50 soldiers that traveled down the road.
That's right. And this is why historiography is not something that's easily done. So I guess what I would say is that we have to be able to not only understand the genre of the text that we're using to try to reconstruct history, which is an imperfect, it's an art form, right? I mean, it's not, this isn't like, there's no processualism here. It's not like it's an art, it's not like it's a strict science or something. So you have to be able to identify the genre of text, but then you also have to understand, like the date. What is it contemporary? Is it much later? Has it been copied and recopied? Whatever. All these things factor in, and so certainly. Last thing, we have documentation like royal inscriptions that are close, I would say, to the genre. Royal inscriptions, basically what these things are is, something, a text about a king and something that he's done, be it going on a campaign or, dedicating an object to a temple or to a deity or rebuilding a temple, whatever. And they write about that. So short royal inscriptions could be like, for Inanna, his lady, 🀭, the great king, the king of Sumer and Ur, dedicated this object, right? Now, there are certain things about that, and that one's pretty short, so it's not really problematic. But if you have one like Sargon's 8th campaign, and Sargon is talking about how he fought against Urartu, and he ran ahead of his army because they were holding it back, and he cut through the mountaintops single-handedly, and it's like, okay, so what can we say about that? We could say, was there a battle with Urartu? Probably, right? But did he go single-handedly like a deity ahead of his army because they were slowing him down? No, right? Those are two sort of extremes in analyzing that. And then a lot of things fall in between. And so the same thing is true with something like the story of David and Naval. What could we say is probably the historical, there's things that we can say, yeah, this probably happened. And what are the things that we say, that's an apologetic, right? So I think it's just a lot of times on a case-by-case basis. But the key is there's certain texts that you're safer taking them at face value, and there are other texts that you just can't take at face value because they're doing something. And if a text is doing something, either theologically or ideologically, you've got to be able to take a step back and say, what is the text doing? And then how do I make sense of the data that's in that text to, come away with either the kernel of historical reality that it represents or the historical data that we can reasonably rely on.
Thank you, Dr. Josh.